Okay, welcome to the second part of the Flixel tutorial. So in the last tutorial, we actually left off with basically the shell of our game. And let's just take a look at what we created. So I have this menu screen. If I hit X, I can start the game, I can move my ship, and I can fire my bullets. So that's how far we got last time. Now obviously the next step is to add in our enemy and basically do some collision detection to determine when our bullets are actually hitting the enemy. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of my my main class called Invaders, I'm going to bump the frame rate up to 60. With Flixel, you can oftentimes get frame rates that high because, again, this is a blitted game. So you're going to want to experiment with the frame rate, but I'm going to put it up pretty high just based on my own tests here. It seems to work good. So now we've created our hero class last time, which contained the definition for our hero graphic and also contained the information about how to move the ship. Now the next step is to actually build our enemy class, which is going to be our class that represents our enemy ships. So I'm going to go into my project folder and I'm just going to create a new ActionScript class, and I'm going to call this enemy. And just like the hero one, this is going to subclass Flixel Sprite. And click Finish. So now inside of the exercise files for this version of the tutorial, I've included a new image called enemy.png. And this is actually a very simple sprite sheet that I created. So let's just take a look at that. And a sprite sheet is basically just a set of animated frames all inside of a single PNG file. And again, these are taken from the Galaga graphics that I found online. Now this is not a very beautiful animation, but you can see what happens here. The first frame is the regular ship, and then it starts to explode over time until the explosion kind of dies out. And there's also a blank frame here that we're going to show obviously when the animation is finished. So what we need to do is to include it here inside of our enemy class. Now we actually don't want to send it to the superconstructor like this because we're not using a simple graphic here. This is going to be an animated graphic. So all we're going to do is to remove that argument here. So let's first embed that image. So embed source is equal to, and it's enemy.png. Now we need to create a class for that. So I'm going to say private var, and I'll just call it enemy graphic. And that's going to be of type class. So now we're still going to send the X and the Y position to the superconstructor, but now we actually want to load in that animated sprite sheet animation. And to do that, we use the load graphic method here. The first thing we pass in is which graphics class we want to use. So that's enemy graphic. Now a Boolean whether or not this is animated, which it is, so we say true. Now this is a Boolean that says basically, do we want it to be able to reverse this animation? We're not going to need that here, so I'm going to say false. And now the important part here is the width and the height. Now this is not the width and the height of the entire graphic. This is the width and the height of a single frame inside of that graphic, which is actually 57 by 64. So again, that's the size of an individual frame, and then Flixel will do the work of determining, of actually pulling out those individual animation frames. So now that we've loaded this graphic, the next thing we want to do is to create an animation. So we can, and again, in a real game, in a big sprite sheet, you might have hundreds of frames, showing every type of animation this object can do. So we're going to use the add animation method. Now the first thing we pass in is a string, which is how we're going to reference it in Flixel. And we only have one animation in there, and it's just, I'm just going to call it explode. Now the next thing we do is to pass in an array of what frames from that sprite sheet that we want to use. So there's actually 6 frames in there. So we're just going to say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those first 6 frames actually make up our animation. Now the next thing we pass in is a number saying what is the frame rate in which we want to play this animation back. Now this is not, this is not the frame rate of our Swift. This is how fast should Flixel iterate through all these individual images. And this you should experiment with. I'm just going to do it at 15 frames per second. So it's actually going to go through each of those frames in the animation at a rate of 15 frames per second. Then the last thing is this a looping animation? And we're going to say false to that, because this is once the ship explodes, obviously, then it's done for, and we're not going to want to play it again because this thing is actually kind of dead. Well, not kind of dead; it's dead. So what we want to do with these enemies is we want them to be falling down from the top. So we're going to set the velocity.y property of these. Now I'm going to give it a little bit of randomness, so I don't want them all coming down at the same speed. So if we go to the Flixel U class, we have a method called random, which is kind of Flixel's version of random number. And I'm going to say Flixel random times 100 plus 40. So the lowest it's going to be for velocity is 40. The highest it could technically be is 140. Okay, so now they're all going to have this movement coming down. And just like we did in the hero class, we want to respond, we want to override the update function. And for right now, we're just going to do super.update, because again, we have to call that in order to get things to work. And all we want to do inside of here is basically say, if the Y position of our enemy is at the bottom of the screen, essentially off the screen, let's put it back at the top so it can come down again. And all we have to do to say that is if Y is greater than 600, which is the height of our game, then Y is equal to -20. We're just going to put it back at the very top out of the screen so that it can start coming down again. Again, these are very simplified game intelligence here. You're going to obviously, in a real game, you're going to want to spend more time and add a lot more logic to how these things are behaving. But for our purposes, this works. Okay, so now the last thing we want to do in here is basically when from our main state, we're going to play the explode animation when we determine a bullet has hit this enemy. But we want to play this entire animation before we actually kill the enemy graphic and get rid of it from memory. So the way in which we do that is we can add an animation callback, which is a function that gets called as our animation is happening. And then we can wait till the end of the animation to kill the actual object. So I'm going to call the add animation callback method, and now just give it a function to call. I'm just going to say onAnimate. Let's create that method. So inside of here, basically, there are 3 parameters that get sent. First is the name of the animation, because this is going to be called anytime anything is animating in this enemy. So if we wanted to determine the name of the animation, we can use that. The frame is sent next, which is a uint, basically, of the frame number. And then index is how many into the sprite sheet this current frame is. So all I'm going to do inside of here is to check if frame is equal to 5, then I'm just going to kill this object. So Flixel sprites all have a method called kill, which if you call that method, it will basically remove this entirely from memory. It will get rid of it. So basically we're saying if this is the frame number here, then we're going to kill this object. Okay, so now we have our enemy class. Now we want to incorporate it into our main state. So with our hero, essentially we don't need to put that in a group because there's only one. But remember here we created a Flixel group for our bullets. Now this is going to be important because when we do collision detection, it's easier and more efficient to do it as a group. So we're also going to create a group for our enemies. So let's create that private var, I'll call it enemies. And again, this is going to be of type Flixel group. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to include a sound effect inside of here for the explosion. Now I've included this in the files for you. It's just called blow.mp3, which is just a little explosion sound. So I'm going to just copy this embed statement, come under here, and this is going to be blow.mp3, and we'll just call the class name blow as well. Okay, so in our create here, let's go ahead and instantiate. We'll come down under where we created the bullets. And now let's instantiate that Flixel group. So enemies is equal to new Flixel group. And now what we're going to do is a very similar thing. And let me go ahead and close TweetDeck there, or it's going to be tweeting all day long. So we're going to do essentially the same thing we did here, where we're creating this for loop and we're adding these elements to our group. So let me just copy this to save time. Now let's just change this. So this is not going to be a bullet. This is going to be an enemy, and this is going to be of type enemy. Now let's go ahead and at the beginning here, let's just create 30. Obviously, this is going to be dependent on your game and how you want to do it. And let's just change these to enemy. And we're actually not going to create a graphic here, so we don't have to worry about that. And now we're going to be adding these to the enemies Flixel group. And this is going to be of type enemy. So you can see there's two things we need to pass to the constructor of our enemy, which is the X and the Y position. And again, we're going to use the Flixel U random class to give us a random number. And we're going to do times 500 plus 50. And that will give us a random position on the X axis that basically keeps it within the bounds of our 600 pixel game. Now for the Y, I don't want them all to start at the same Y position, or else they're all going to be coming down essentially on top of one another. I'm going to say negative Flixel U dot random, and I'm going to times 400. That will give me a negative number between 0 and 400. So again, they're going to be dispersed, more. They're going to be dispersed in a better way on the Y-axis. Okay, so now each time I come through this for loop, I'm creating a new enemy, giving it a random position, and putting him in that enemy's Flixel group. And again, we're doing that because we actually want to be able to do collision detection between the hero bullets group and the enemies group. Again, we want to do that as a group, not as individual objects. So the other thing I want to do here is I need to actually add that enemy into our Flixel, essentially the Flixel display list here, so that it's visible. Okay, so let's test things and see where we're at, see if we have any errors. So here it is. If I press X, and now we can see we have our objects are actually moving down. And again, once they get to the bottom, they basically start again at the top. And there's quite a few heroes in there, maybe a little too much, but. And I have a duplicate variable definition here, so I'll just say no need to redefine that. Okay, so now I have everything moving. Now we want to move to collision detection. Well, this is where Flixel is extremely easy. So all we need to do is come into our update function. And remember, this is called on every frame. And to do collision detection, we're going to use a method in the Flixel U class called overlap. So Flixel U dot overlap, and you can see it expects three things. It expects first, the first two are which two Flixel objects do you want to test the collisions on. Then the third one is what function do you want to have called when this happens. So for which objects, for this it's simple. We want to test collisions between hero bullets and enemies. So anytime there's a collision between those two groups, we want to have it call a function, and I'm going to say on overlap. That's the function we want to call. So let's go ahead and create that method now. Now there's two parameters that get sent to this, which are the two objects, the two Flixel sprites that have overlapped with one another. So I'm going to create the first parameter. I'm just going to call it sprite1 s1. And again, this is going to be of type Flixel sprite. Then s2. Again, it would be of type Flixel sprite. And we know which one it is based on the order of the way it appears here. So S1 is going to contain a bullet, and S2 is going to contain an enemy once there's a collision determined. So when there's a collision that happens, all we want to do is to say S2, which is our enemy sprite, and we basically want to play the explode animation that we defined in our enemy class. So again, when there's a collision, we're saying play the explode animation in our enemy. And what that does is it plays this animation, and then once it gets to the 5th frame, it kills this object. So it's essentially killing the object after the animation happens. Now lastly, we want to play our explode sound effect. So we're going to use Flixel G dot play, and we want to play the blow sound. Okay, so let's test this. So here's our game. I'll hit X. You can see our animations are happening. Now one thing you'll notice is that we're not killing the bullet. So even when the bullet hits something, it's exploding the alien, but the bullet is still going. And that's because we haven't actually killed the bullet. Now we're not going to deal with that in this. Let's just pretend we have, super bullets that never die. They just keep on going. If we wanted to, we could kill the bullet and so on and so forth. But again, we're not going to deal with that here. Now, one thing you're going to want to do, more than likely, is you're going to want to test, when a certain number of enemies, or when all of the enemies have actually been killed, then we want to go to another game state, maybe level 2. Well, we can do that inside of the update function. So what we can do is we can say if enemies, which is our Flixel group, and then we can use the count living method, which returns the number of living aliens in our Flixel group. So if that is equal to 0, that means there's no living enemies anymore. Then we can go to the next level in the game. But just to kind of give you an example, we're just going to go back to the menu state. So again, the way we switch states here is to say Flixel G dot state is equal to new, and it's menu state. Again, in a real-world scenario, you'd want to go to level or state 2, which is level 2. But again, just for example's sake, we're just going to go ahead and go back to the menu state. So let's try that now. Load it up. Hit X. Let me kill all these guys. So there's the last one. And you can see we've now killed that alien, and now we've gone back to the menu state. So again, in this particular case, the enemies are pretty easy to defeat. In fact, the enemies can touch the ship completely and nothing will happen. But again, it's very easy to deal with that because all you have to do is do another overlap between the enemies and the hero. And if that happens, then obviously the hero is going to die, and you're going to lose you're going to lose a player here. But these are the basic mechanics of creating a Flixel game. Again, adding better logic in here all just takes place inside of these update functions, and again, doing more detailed kind of things in the overlap functions. But this gives you a basic overview of how to create a simple game in Flixel, how to import sprite sheets. Now I'm going to be doing some other tutorials more in-depth about creating sprite sheets using Flash and things like that. But again, this should give you a good starting point for creating some really nice games using Flixel.